Thank you very much indeed. Thank you and welcome to you all to this discussion this evening. It's the third of a series that Communications Inc. has been holding here at the club about climate change and various aspects of climate change. Tonight we're looking at the issues of climate change and human rights. They're not normally necessarily two issues that are automatically associated with each other, and yet in that spectrum of climate change and development, human rights are absolutely at the heart of the impacts of climate change on people. Climate change, I suppose, is not so much about polar bears, but about people. And it's those issues of what happens when people are affected by climate change and what are their rights when they are affected that we want to talk about tonight. Everyone talks about, there's a phrase, isn't there, climate refugees. Well, who are these people? What are their rights when they're displaced internally? What are their rights when they're displaced across borders? It's something that's been recognised by the climate change community internationally for decades. I mean, 20 years ago, the IPCC warned that human migration might be one of the biggest and most serious effects of climate change, and yet it's never really been focused as the heart of the discussions in all the international negotiations. We'll try and put that right tonight. So what rights do people have to life, to liberty, to security, to food, to water, to housing, to shelter when they're moved by climate change? Because their status as climate refugees, I suppose, is at the heart of this. If your country, if you're the Maldives, say, and your country sinks beneath the waves, what nationality do you have if your country no longer exists? Does that country still exist? There's a whole range of issues like that which we can talk about this evening. We have a splendid panel. Lawrence McGinty, the science editor of ITV News, is with us this evening. Lawrence has been and seen the impacts of climate change on people and on their rights directly, and he'll be showing us a little bit of that in a moment. To my left, if I can get my names right, to my left is Christoph Schwarz. Far left is Christoph Schwarz, who is a staff lawyer with FIELD, which is the Foundation for International Environmental Law and Development. FIELD's been going for 20 years now as a group of international lawyers dealing with climate and environmental issues. Sitting next to him is Colmar Kunakoin, who is the Senior Director of Campaigns at Amnesty. Again, Amnesty deals very largely with human rights. You don't necessarily associate Amnesty with issues of climate and environment, but it's beginning to become a more important part of their work. And finally, Marine Destrey, who is a researcher for LEAD, which is the Leadership for Environmental Development International. And LEAD specialises in empowering people, giving people the tools they need to be able to adapt to climate change issues, to be able to make the changes they need to empower them to make it happen. And she's very welcome to have her with us this evening. So we'll hear a few words from each of the panel, and then we're very much opening it up to you. We want a good discussion going tonight. We've got until around about 8:30, and I'll ask, if I may, first of all, Lawrence McGinty to start and tell us what he's seen when it comes to the impact of climate change on the human rights of people he's seen around the world. Lawrence.
Thanks, Julian. I suppose, in a way, being a television journalist, the issue of human rights and climate change is one that comes upon you rather quickly, because as soon as you start to try and film climate change, you find it almost impossible. What exactly do you film? A melting glacier? Well, you can't really film that. Rising sea levels? How the hell do you film that? So very rapidly you decide people have to be at the core of the story you want to tell. And often what we're looking at when, or what you're looking at when you look at the effects of climate change, involve issues of human rights. This really was driven home for me 4 years ago when my editor gave me a dream assignment and said, I want you to go to 5 locations on 5 continents and show what climate change is doing to people. And we did a series which we call 3 Degrees to Disaster, just as the scientific community was deciding that it was really 2 degrees to disaster. But never mind, it's a few degrees to disaster, let's agree on that. We went to China, to Chad, to Brazil, to Greenland, and to the Maldives, which was the most arduous of all the assignments, really. And in every case, we had to tell that story through the eyes of people or through the effects that that was having on people. And believing that a picture is worth 1,000 words, I've brought 2 clips from 2 of those reports. This one, the first frame of which you see there, is from Qinghai province in China, which is the westernmost province just before you get to Tibet, and is actually on the Tibetan Plateau. Although if you say that to the Chinese officials, they get very angry because the word Tibetan is more or less banned. This was the last piece we did. Each of these reports was about 5 minutes long, which is rather long for News at 10 and the ITV Evening News. We also did live reports, except from China, because at that time you couldn't do live reports from China. But in all the other cases, we did live reports on every bulletin. So it was a major commitment for ITV News. We also did other reports that other reporters did around the world and from the UK. This one, though, is about Qinghai province in China, which is subject to great threats to farming. Most of the farming there is yak farming, and desertification is destroying the grazing lands. Could you play the first one, please, Melissa? Thank you. These are the mountains of northern China. Beyond these peaks, the Himalayas and Everest. They call this the roof of the world. It's here that the waters of the Yellow River arise. And it's here that climate change is destroying a way of life and threatening 120 million people who depend on China's mother river. It took us 2 days to climb 14,000 feet to the plateau. We came to investigate claims that global warming is melting the glaciers and drying up the lakes that feed the Yellow River. Temperatures here have risen by 1 degree in the last 30 years, turning grassland into desert, with rainfall dropping by 20% in the last decade. For local yak herdsmen, it could be the end of a way of life that survived for centuries. We met Sao Bo and his family, who've lived here for 50 years. He told me that when he was a boy, the grass grew knee-high. Now his environment was being destroyed. A devout Buddhist, he could only pray for more rain. Climate change isn't the only factor. Overgrazing too is destroying the grasslands. But lower rainfall and higher evaporation linked to warming are causing a dramatic decline.
Our reports mentions that during the past 50 years, nearly 1/3 of the grassland at the Yellow River source region has degraded. And by 2020, more than 2/3 of the grassland will degrade.
With lower rainfall, lakes are also drying up. This one, called Star Sea, has shrunk by 25% in the last 30 years. We've just driven up from the shores of Star Sea Lake, and what you can see behind me used to be a continuation of it. One great lake as far as the eye can see, to the hills on the other side. The lake has shrunk so much, we could drive along a track that was once completely underwater. 3,000 lakes in this county alone have dried up altogether. Our guide, Nima, told me these lakes are crucial, holding nearly half the water that feeds the Yellow River.
But it's shrinking all the time, isn't it?
That means flows in the river itself are falling dramatically, in the worst year by nearly half. And that's having disastrous consequences. Xiao Qi and his widowed mother are environmental refugees. They used to herd yaks and goats, but the grazing was so poor they had to move. Xiao told me he was selling this goat skin. He'd get about £5 for it. I asked how many goats he had. Just this one.
Yes.
300 families live in the same refugee village. They depend on government handouts to eke out a precarious living. Well, Julia was asking about environmental refugees. There they are. I think that I want to make 2 quick points and then show you one more clip. The interesting thing there is that there's an interplay of different factors. Climate change, it seems to me, never has a direct dominant effect on anything almost. for example, we later on went to several of the villages that had provided the refugees that went to that camp. And also were translocated hundreds of miles to a new city. And we met people who'd been left behind and asked why haven't you gone? Did you want to stay? And they told us very vehemently, no, that wasn't the case at all. They were not selected to go because they had crossed the local Communist Party. They were not exactly agitators, but they were the awkward squad in that village, and they just hadn't been selected on pure political grounds. Now that seems to be a very clear-cut case of someone being denied a right to... I mean, they were trying to eke out an existence in almost impossible conditions, and could do nothing else. They didn't get the handouts, they couldn't go to the big cities. And the second thing is that's a very direct example. The desertification in that area is well known. The guy you saw that wasn't asked, that didn't have a name on, came from Greenpeace, who'd just written a report about that. And the drying up of the Yellow River is well known, and other rivers in China. It's not alone. Because of that, we could make that link quite easily. The second one I want to show you, which is a bit shorter, is about a tribe in Mato Grosso, in Brazil, which was only contacted by outsiders in 1974. We were, I think, I'm not sure, but I think we were the first cameras to go in there. And their story is a lot more complicated. Can we play that clip? There's about 10 seconds of black here, and then it'll come up.
At first, the path through the forest was easy, but soon we lagged behind the Nawe Indians, leading us to their fishing camp. It was only 30 years ago these Indians had their first contact with the outside world.
Okay, do you want to lead the way?
But despite the smiling faces, that contact is now threatening their very existence.
Hello?
All around them, the forest is being felled and burnt for farming, bringing new threats to their way of life. The Nawe say this is their land. They name the rivers, and they catch the fish that provide their food supplies.
The Indians are building a dam here so they can lay their fish traps. It's a tradition that goes back generations, but now it's a tradition that's threatened by deforestation and the farming that follows.
They say farmers burned down their last fishing camp and that now they fear violence. Chief Mari Karozaeni told us the conflict is escalating and they're desperate.
In the last 2 years, the felling has risen dramatically. It's doubled, and so we're thinking of retaliation, perhaps burning down farmhouses and destroying bridges, because the situation is unbearable.
That presented me with one of those moments that in your career as a journalist stops you in your tracks, because after we'd finished the interview, through 2 interpreters, he asked me, can I ask you a question? And I said, sure, yeah, go ahead. And he said, we've told you about the farmers burning our villages, which are important not just economically because that's what they do, they fish, but also for religious, spiritual reasons. They believe that the spirits of their ancestors live in that fishing camp, which is not their permanent home, it's just a summer camp. But that's where the spirits of the ancients live. And so it's very precious to them. And he asked me, because of all the incursions that are happening, that keep on happening despite our protests, despite us writing to the government and so on, we're now at our wits' ends. Do you think we're justified in killing people? And that really stopped me in my tracks. I didn't know what the hell to say. I mean, I dodged the question and said, I think people would be sympathetic whatever action you took, but violent action might put a few people off, or some such waffle. But it's a real showstopper, that question, because from their point of view, this is a threat to their very existence. We made that in those films in 2006. Since then, things have got worse. Since then, they're building a series of dams higher up on the river that they fish, which are being built to provide power and irrigation for soya farming. And they believe that's poisoned their fish. They've caught no fish at that camp for the last 2 years. Earlier this year, they occupied one of the construction sites and held the construction workers hostage. I think it's quite feasible that they might now really take the law into their own hands. Their village is a protected Indian area recognised by the government of Mato Grosso. The fishing grounds aren't, even though they're spiritually and in every other way so important to them. And I think that illustrates the point I'd like to make, is that climate change never acts alone. There are lots of political issues, there are lots of social issues, there are lots of other factors here, but it is a driving force almost everywhere I went. It's a driving force that propels threats which might otherwise be able to be solved, that makes them insoluble. In Chad, the drying up of Lake Chad, which means that despite the government's attempts at irrigation, the pressure on farming is phenomenal. In the Maldives, the pressure on tourism because the coral reefs are being destroyed, and so on. Everywhere, climate change is the main driver, even though it doesn't act alone. Thanks.
Lawrence, thank you. So that's a very clear and very splendid example, if you like, of the way climate change is beginning to affect people already. And we're beginning to already see climate change impinging upon issues of human rights. Human rights has a kind of legal framework internationally which sets out what people's rights are and how I should have them. But that framework is clearly being challenged by the sort of things that we've heard from Lawrence here now. How do you protect those people, give those people those rights? So can I turn next to Christoph Schwartz from Field to give us some understanding of the legal framework which we're now working in and what potentially are the areas which need to be addressed and changed to try and give those people the rights that they clearly deserve.
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize that I have to take you to a different climate change arena just for a brief moment, because we as lawyers spend a lot of time in the international negotiations on climate change, where we predominantly advise developing countries, and in particular a group of Pacific Island countries, AOSIS. These negotiators in general are totally outnumbered by negotiators from so-called developed countries, and we provide help and assistance where necessary and possible. And in these international climate change negotiations, we develop mechanisms, systems, and approaches in order to deal with adaptation, potentially climate change refugees at some point in the future. And we talk about finance and what sources of finance there could potentially be in the future. What interests me personally most about international law, however, is how relevant can it possibly be on the ground. And I've done a lot of work in Ethiopia and Uganda recently, and these countries have quite strong provisions on the right to clean and healthy environment, for instance. Equally, these countries have signed up to any human rights convention that there is. But in practice, these rights are totally irrelevant, unfortunately. So I think using a human rights context in order to address climate change really appeals to me. I think it's potentially a great step forward. But I think it needs to be supplemented by other ideas and approaches. And I would, for instance, add something on environmental justice, the implementation of norms. And I also think that we here in the North need to ask us whether, if we talk about human rights and human rights violations, who perpetrates these violations? And if we talked about human rights violations in Darfur or elsewhere in the world, would we then really think about a 20-year scenario of phasing them out and gradually by 2050 maybe reduce them significantly? So I don't have a particular answer to any of these questions, but that's maybe something we could talk about a little bit.
Okay. Colm, I mean, Amnesty deals with human rights all the time. It's your bread and butter. But I suspect climate change and environmental issues have not necessarily been to the top of your human rights agenda during most of Amnesty's existence. How much is that coming up the agenda, and where do you see environment and climate change beginning to impact the human rights agenda?
Yeah, well, I suppose the organisations in the area of development, human rights and the environment have become increasingly integrated in their approach and responses to issues like climate change and development. The move towards a so-called rights-based approach as a way of working for all organisations is well established, and moving in that direction, it was inevitable that Amnesty would start to focus on the right to a healthy environment to some extent. I guess the human rights framework provides a significant part of the framework for engaging with governments around climate change. Number one, we have absolute rights which the governments have an obligation to fulfil. They have a right to protect their citizens by not undermining their rights. They have a right to. They have an obligation to respect rights and protect rights, protecting citizens against the activities of corporations, for example, loggers, the kind of activities we saw in the clip earlier on. There's also an obligation on governments to fulfil rights, which means that they have to make decisions around laws and policies, around budgets, which are moving progressively towards the realisation of rights, like, for example, around housing or schools or education or healthcare. So this is an obligatory legal framework which is there for campaigners to use in the courtroom, to use in the media, to use in international circles, to ensure that the spotlight and the responsibility is laid squarely with governments to address issues like climate change. I just want to pick up to introduce this three areas where the human rights lens is crucial to the campaign against climate change. Number one is discrimination. There's an obligation on governments to ensure that minorities and vulnerable groups are not discriminated against. And yet when you look at the communities that are most affected by climate change, the people who are most vulnerable, they come from the minorities, the indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, women. Are the most vulnerable groups are the ones that are suffering most. A report just published by UNICEF points to the fact that in 10 of the poorest countries of the world, discrimination is increasing. In almost half the countries that they looked at, in the bottom 26 countries, discrimination was increasing. The poor are getting poorer and more vulnerable rather than the opposite. And that discrimination lens brings us right into the area of human rights. Okay? Because when people are not being treated equally, when the laws and the policies of the state are having a disproportionately negative effect on rural communities, on indigenous communities, on women, these are human rights abuses. And here we use the human rights framework. Secondly is the area of accountability. We've seen the complete absence of accountability, where states and where government agencies and political actors are held to account for decisions that they have made which are wrecking the environment and wrecking people's lives and impacting negatively on their human rights. We've seen some tremendous advances in the use of the courtroom, for example, around access to antiretroviral drugs in South Africa, housing in South Africa, right to information or right to food in India. We've seen how campaigns around development and economic, social and cultural rights have won battles to hold the state accountable through the courts. We've seen how national human rights institutions like human rights commissions are becoming increasingly powerful and toothy in terms of actually holding governments accountable. And that accountability framework, where we're saying to governments that they're not going to get away with it, that the force of the law and the human rights framework is going to be brought to bear in them, is crucially important. And the third and last thing I just highlight as an opener is the human rights as a means to, as a process to ensure that people are included, that we have participation. People have the right to be heard, to be consulted, to be involved in decision making. And for example, around adaptation strategies and the spending of the adaptation funding that's going to be made available to countries in the developing world, how is that money going to be spent? It's got to be spent in concert with and in communication with and in consultation with the communities that are most affected. But the reality is they have no voice. They have no access to decision making, no access even to information about how much money is coming into their countries and their communities, and or how that money is being allocated and spent. That's a fundamental human rights issue. People have a right to be heard and a right to be involved in decision making about their own lives and their own livelihoods. So those three human rights lenses, participation, accountability and non-discrimination, are crucial to the debate around climate change.
Com, thank you. Finally, Marine, who came to LEAD, I think, specifically to deal with and bring human rights issues into the work that LEAD does in terms of empowering people to be able to deal with the situations that they're facing and to give them the tools they need to be able to do that. How has your human rights experience been able to help LEAD, and what have you been able to do?
Thanks, Jillian. Well, I think I have kind of the easy job because I'll be able to kind of respond to every approach to that question. We came to consider human rights mostly because we got funded for a human rights-based approach to climate change adaptation. And once we got funded for that project, and we thought, what are we going to do with it? What is actually human rights-based to climate change adaptation? So we kind of had to look a bit more into the issue, and we could have looked at the catastrophes, human rights violations. We could have looked at the international negotiations. We could have looked at the holding accountable the states, but that's not what we do. We do leadership, we do empowerment, we train people, we give them opportunities, and that's what LEAD is about. So we decided to look about what human rights can bring to that. And we decided that human rights can bring three different things. First, I think it can bring a name to climate change adaptation, because climate change adaptation is quite blurred at the moment. So I think putting human rights in it is actually quite interesting. Second, it can bring a philosophy, because the way you look at climate change adaptation needs a framework, and the framework, guidelines, barriers, that's what we need at the moment in the negotiations and in the framing of that notion and that concept. And thirdly, I think we can look at human rights as a tool, and that's what we decided to go for. How can we look at human rights as a tool? Well, rights come with a whole lot of different legal and non-legal arrangements that are supposed to make them real and effective, that are supposed to realize human rights on the ground. So we decided to go to Malawi, where we have one project of climate change adaptation, and kind of do a field study about how would that be credible to incorporate human rights tools into that program. What we found is that legal opportunities and barriers are surrounding every project, and they're surrounding climate change adaptation projects as well. So we decided to kind of go forward and look into those opportunities, looking into a bit more of the positive aspect of human rights for climate change adaptation. And we actually found that you have a lot of dispositions that exist in the law, that exist surrounding all those human rights, and that can be used, but are not being used because nobody knows about them, because nobody's interested into them, because it doesn't seem practical to actually use them for communities who are legally empowered. So that's actually the project we decided to go forward with. We're focusing on Mali, Malawi, and Senegal at the moment, and we're just at the beginning. So don't ask me too many precise questions and detail about that project. We're just designing it at the moment, but we're really looking forward at that issue.
What do you think will be what you hope will be the outcome of that? I mean, what?
We're actually hoping at developing practical workshop to be able to give that knowledge to people, first to NGOs and CSOs, in order to tell them, okay, you have this framework, what it is, who are you going to be able to talk to, and what kind of tools are you going to be able to incorporate within your program to bring the law to people and to bring out this climate change adaptation that is necessary.
You said as well that to a degree the tools are there, the human rights laws are there, the international framework is there, the national frameworks are there. And yet, does climate change mean that we need to come up with a new set of rules? Or do we need to add to the existing rules to be able to cope with climate change?
Well, undoubtedly there are issues which are pushing the boundaries of the normative human rights framework at the moment. I mean, the one you mentioned, climate refugees will definitely raise some questions around the Refugee Convention in time. Also, intergenerational rights, which is the really big debate, in terms of the rights of our grandchildren to a healthy environment, which are, our responsibility now, but are not codified in terms of the human rights laws we know it right now. But those, from our perspective, getting into those abstract debates is a distraction, because the human rights framework that we have and the obligations in the state that we have now and the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and so forth provide really robust and strong tools to hold governments accountable for the failures, the abuses and the violations that they're perpetrating right now. So rather than allowing ourselves to be distracted into these ethereal debates, let's use what we have and the tools we have and ram that message home.
Who can use those tools?
Well, I think the people who have to use them are the communities that are experiencing, the environmental degradation, the impact on their livelihoods and indeed their lives. But I think the obligation on us is to use the big frameworks that are there. I mean, for example, we need to be locating this discussion in the context of the General Assembly that's coming up next week in New York, where the governments of the world are gathering to review progress on the Millennium Development Goals. Now, the Millennium Development Goals are a development framework. In fact, it's the only show in town when it comes to governments channeling resources into addressing development problems. And much as governments would like us to talk about climate change out here through the COP process and through financing for development and development programming through the MDGs, the obligation on us is to drag it all together and say what's coming up next week in New York, where governments are talking about the MDGs, is a climate change issue. It is a development issue. It's a human rights issue. And unless governments are willing to talk about these issues in an integrated way, and unless we're willing to push them to talk about these things in an integrated way, we're going to see this continued kind of fragmentation and governments evading accountability. So in terms of who should use these frameworks, every UN agency, every NGO, every state has got an obligation to use these frameworks and to use the General Assembly as the centre point where we can have ultimate accountability and ensure that the MDG frameworks that are being discussed next week are discussed in a context where climate change is centre stage.
Christoph, as a lawyer, an international lawyer, is there a need to strengthen the international legal framework to be able to deal with climate change and climate change refugees, of course?
Yeah, I think that's a very trendy question in academic literature at the moment. Do we need another new framework to deal with climate change refugees? I think the clearly dominant opinion in the literature says that under the current laws, climate change refugees or people who migrate because of environmental conditions are not covered, and therefore we need some kind of new framework or agreement. I'm a bit worried by the notion that we always look at migration as a dangerous or somehow scary thing, because ultimately it's probably the best adaptation strategy that people can develop. And therefore, maybe rather than to look at a new human rights instrument, we should follow recommendations that say countries in the north and the south should develop agreements in order to accommodate the needs of migrating populations, and find solutions in collaboration how the needs of people are met and they can possibly return at a later point in time.
Okay. What about the scale of the problem? I mean, Lawrence, do you have any sense of the scale of what might happen over the coming decades in terms of human rights and the refugees, the migration issues that have?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of almost a daydream. I mean, these things are happening now. We filmed environmental refugees 4 years ago. Other people have done the same. The city you didn't see in China, the new city, they were moving 500,000 people into that. And Christoph is right. For those people that there was at the time, it's probably the only way they could adapt to climate change. They certainly couldn't survive in the places they come from because the grazing just wasn't there. They couldn't continue to be yak farmers. In that new town, they were provided with a home which had electricity. They weren't given government handouts. They had to farm. They had to find a way of making a living. But at least they had a chance of doing that, where the villages they came from, they had no chance at all. And I think it's also the really good question that Christoph asked right at the beginning is, who are the perpetrators here? Who's to blame for that? I mean, you can't blame the Chinese government if desertification forces 500,000 people to move. You can attack them for the way they did it, which may have been discriminatory, and they may have been able to do that without being held to book. But that's a real problem of, you know, if Lake Chad dries up, you can't blame the government. The government's an awful government in Chad. It does all sorts of idiotic, stupid and terrible things, but you can't blame them for that. So I think that the question of who's the perpetrator is a real key one. How it plays out in international law, I don't know. But these issues are really happening now and have been happening for some time. And it's really, I'm really encouraged by what Kalman said about people in India and other countries using the law to fight back.
Should human rights specifically be an issue on the agenda at the international negotiations, Cancun and then Johannesburg, as part of the wider push towards an international climate agreement? Should specifically human rights be there rather than the sort of more generic adaptation or mitigation? Anybody?
Well, absolutely. I mean, from our perspective, absolutely, it has to be there. I mean, the issues that are being discussed are human rights issues, and the issues that are on the table are human rights issues. I mean, so in reality, you know, the agenda is all about human rights. The thing is that the states are not embracing the human rights framework as part of the solutions that they're discussing, and that's what we have to push, and that's what we have to move forward. Take, for example, slums. You know, there's the number of people in slums, in cities, you know, that are mushrooming is increasing exponentially. It's now over 1 billion. It's heading towards 1.4 billion by 2020. These are people who are forced either as refugees or internal migrants to move into cities where they have absolute access to no basic services. Education, health, housing, etc., not available to them because the conditions in slums are dreadful. You have increased violence against women in slums. For example, Amnesty has just documented in Nairobi how, you know, women who can't access sanitation safely are exposed to sexual violence. So all of these spin-off and negative impact on their human rights because, you know, climate change and other push factors are driving them into slums. And there's no, you know, without addressing human rights in the context of the COP negotiations, you won't get to the hub of that problem. You won't find the solutions that you need.
You, Christoph, you said at the beginning that you field acts as advisors to small island states and so on. Small island states are in a unique position because they are most vulnerable. Indeed, they might actually no longer exist with rising sea levels. What problems does that throw up in terms of the human rights of the people who used to live there? If they're, you know, if the people of the Maldives or the Carteret Islands or whatever are forced to go and live somewhere else, what issues do we have about their rights and the rights of not necessarily the people, but also the nation, the sovereign nation?
Well,
where do you start?
Where do you start? Yeah, I mean, I think the problem that we have under international law is that everything is sealed off with a national level at the moment. You have states negotiating with each other. All the other actors are not really important, and international law also acts under the assumption of diplomatic representation, that it is your state that represents you and that acts on your behalf. So if that state is gone, you have a problem. But I just wanted to quickly say something about human rights in the climate change negotiation, because we advise countries and we also advise civil society organizations, and it is quite remarkable that in the last year, I think human rights have become an issue, and that I think there is now a paragraph 1 bis. Bis is, you know, one of these options that countries insert into the negotiation text or the drafting text that says the agreement or the climate change shall be tackled, you know, with due consideration of human rights, the rights of marginalized groups, and Mother Earth. So I think that goes back to a proposal made by Venezuela and Bolivia. And then there are there are various issues, like, for instance, the whole discussion on RED, reduced emission on deforestation, forest degradation, where civil society organizations and also a couple of countries make it very clear that individual rights have to be recognized, and you can't just go and fence off the rainforest. So I think increasingly there is a realization that climate change is not something environmentalists deal with, but, you know, society as a whole and human rights activists and everybody else.
Okay, well, let's turn to you guys. What you think of these issues, and any questions you might have for our panelists up here. There's plenty of hands going up there. There's a gentleman at the back there. We've got some microphones going around with the beard there. Yes, there you go. The microphone's coming to you now.
Hello. My question was with regards to policy, both in the developing world and here. And is there any policy in debate to deal, in terms of immigration policy, to deal with climate migrants, or in terms of foreign aid for developing countries to deal with the issue of climate migrants? And if there isn't a policy debate going on about this, and if there isn't policy being proposed, why is that? Why do you think that is?
Anybody? What do you think, Christoph? Do we need a policy in that respect?
I think there are various fora and international efforts to tackle this question. I think it's part of a Habitat Summit, and but yes, I mean, you need a much better coordinated effort to think about this, and whether you do it in the context of climate change and adaptation, or as a matter as such, I don't think it makes a great deal of difference. Important is that countries engage with this seriously, and that at some point in time they open up their war chest and their pockets in order to finance the significant costs that, you know, are potentially involved.
Another question, yes, at the front here. Sorry, is the microphone just coming to you now? Yeah.
I think it's really important to keep rights separate from justice in this debate, as somebody said. Can I ask, I'm trying to think of a way of phrasing a bigger question simply, but the international negotiations started off on the basis of international justice. The poor countries were going to be paid to develop while the rich countries slowed down first. That was the whole basis of it. It seems now the West is trying to withdraw from that and go to a sort of technical fix. This is a big problem, forget Kyoto, forget everything else, we've just got to solve the problem. And as a result of that, I think we're in danger of, rights are going to be in serious danger. And for instance, in the forest talks that you mentioned, in the rush to get a deal, forest peoples and people dependent on the forest are going to be left out and a bit crushed. Well, that's the danger, because let's save the forests at all costs. Do deals between governments, and governments hate forest peoples and people that wander around, and they don't like them because they're administratively untidy. Similarly, climate change is in serious danger of supplanting traditional aid now. Even Britain is now giving a minimum of 10% of its aid budget to climate change, and that's going to increase. So I think there is already very clear evidence that rights are in danger of going under in this rush to deal with this sort of huge problem, and that the West, which maybe isn't very keen on expanding aid, is going to use it at the same time, which will also have an effect on rights, although aid isn't a rights issue.
Do you get a sense, Marine, that rights are being trampled on, and that's maybe part of the reasons why you guys have taken on the role that you have?
I think it's definitely a risk, and I think this question very well underlies one problem, which is the fact that climate change might violate human rights. It might human rights might be a solution to it, but it's not that straightforward. It's actually climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation might conflict with human rights, and some results of the programs of climate change might actually affect the population more than they actually enhance those human rights. I think though that is not a kind of unsolvable problem. I do believe that we have to take it into consideration, but some approach such as sustainable development, which we're very much promoting at LEAD, might be a way forward to actually get those issues together and look at a way to combining them and to get them working in the same way and the same direction.
Is there a way to avoid those rights being trampled on in those international negotiations?
Well, they certainly are being trampled on. I mean, if you take the refugee question earlier on as an example, I mean, there is no policy debate on climate migrants and climate refugees. Indeed, the policy debate is, you know, how do states erode the international protections that are there already for migrants and for refugees? I mean, Fortress Europe is a debate that's playing out around the world where countries are putting up borders, and you know that security-driven debate is creating a huge problem that is undermining human rights, exactly as we've just heard, and creating barriers to people, for example, in the Sundarbans of Bangladesh, who are on the move in one of the poorest parts of the world, and the stress that's going to put on, you know, in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, an area that's already riven with conflict, and there's no debate, there's no policy discussion going on about how we're going to solve that issue, and yes, rights are being trampled on in the middle of that, in the middle of all that, and you know, yes, I agree, we have to have multifaceted solutions, we have to take an environmental justice, a sustainable development approach, but we have to use human rights as the strong legal framework that they are, as part of any multifaceted approach to governments in their policy discussions.
Okay, another question, yes. Gentleman in the front here.
Thank you. I mean, I'm a little bit confused because I have this feeling that you're almost saying that the whole climate change negotiation process almost can have a negative effect on human rights protection, which I think is not at all like that. At the end of the day, human rights are absolutely in the center of the climate change negotiation. And the right to water, and the right to work, access to land, and so on. I mean, that's the very essence. And in the climate change negotiations, one of the main issues is how to raise the $100 billion that are necessary from 2020 every year, which will go exactly for protecting the natural habitat, protecting the work of people in poor countries. And this 100 billion is a small part of what has to be mobilized, and probably will be mobilized. So to say that this effort will somehow suppress the human rights is probably not exactly very correct. Thank you.
Okay, there was another thought over there from the guy in the corner with the beard there.
Thanks very much. It was very interesting to see your report, Lawrence. I lived just near that area for a year and saw the terrible devastation that's being done to people in China through climate change and other reasons. Just wanted to bring up two issues in terms of what we're going to do to solve this. I think possibly opposite to what the gentleman has just spoken, there's a lot of scepticism that the COP process, the Conference of the Parties, the UNFCCC, is going to be able to solve these issues in the time needed. Christoph, you wear the expression of "I do" of the man who's been to too many of them and has this kind of exasperated expression about where they're going. So there's lots of other initiatives that are coming up now with potential solutions, and I'm interested to get the panel's thoughts on two of them. One, it was briefly mentioned, the Bolivia and Venezuela, and the meeting held in Cochabamba earlier this year in Bolivia around reframing this debate as being about Mother Earth and us being part of Mother Earth, and whether that can incorporate a more rights-based agenda. And the other, I did a little bit of work with a phenomenal attorney from the Philippines called Antonio Apoza, who is looking at the potential for this being brought legally through the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. And I know there's a number of groups looking at the potential for some governments to actually be taken to court because of the impact that they're having on people's lives and on the planet around the world. That's an interesting thought. Christoph, would the International Court, take the second one first really, would the International Court, Criminal Court, be the right forum for this sort of thing?
I'm not sure climate change would qualify as an attack, for instance, or as or that you could convincingly construe a case of genocide around climate change. I'd be very careful with that. But I think there are options under international law to use, for instance, the International Court of Justice, not the International Criminal Court, but the International Court of Justice in The Hague, to take maybe one of the large polluter nations to court and use a judgment to unlock the current negotiation process, or maybe even to get them to pronounce certain principles that then can lead the negotiation process in the future. We're preparing a paper on this. Otherwise, I'm not entirely sure. I wish I had an answer. I wish I could tell you what the ideal process should look like in order to come to a fair and equitable climate change arrangement. I think there are lots of initiatives, yes, and I think civil society hasn't played its last card yet. I think, and you know, it doesn't really matter whether I talk to young people in Catford, where we live, or somewhere in developing countries. They're not that bothered about driving cars, or I mean, they all, I think, take their environmental concerns very seriously. So I'm kind of thinking there might maybe be something that civil society can do in different parts of the world, and to agree in order to, you know, get states to move into a particular direction. But that's probably an old hippie talking, so I don't know.
Lawrence, I mean, you've been to some of these things as well, like me. You've spent those through the night sessions waiting for things to happen. The Venezuelan and Bolivian president, this idea of Mother Earth as a way of framing the negotiations, has that got any chance at all of being able to bring in with it that perspective of human rights which we're talking about tonight?
I mean, I think the problem is that since Copenhagen, everyone knows that the international processes are just locked together and aren't going anywhere. And I think people are pretty desperate to get some kind of alternative, to either to try to unjam that logjam, or to provide a different kind of mechanism. Christoph knows more about that than I do. Maybe that's a possibility. But one thing has struck me way back at Rio in the first Earth Summit, and we spent 2 weeks in rainforest there with local indigenous people, and we then took them to the conference, and they were kind of blank, really. I mean, we explained as best we could what was going on. They talked to lots of other people, and at the end of it, they thought it was all entirely irrelevant, because their focus was so much on Mother Earth, if you like. Their focus was so much on their relationship with their land. And I think that's often the case with indigenous people, that their whole existence and religion and social being is tied up with where they live, that it's actually quite difficult for them to see beyond that. And it's actually, I mean, it's really quite chastening as a reporter, because when you go to a place like that, they have really high expectations. They think that your article, your report, is going to make a huge difference, and that next week something is going to happen, or next month, and it doesn't. And I think they become very rapidly disillusioned with these processes, and fall back on their own resources. And in that case of the Enanawe, it's should we go around killing the farmers? Should we occupy the dam site and hold the construction workers hostage? I think it's local action, maybe not necessarily of that kind, but I think it's local action that's actually going to force those issues, perhaps with some kind of international expression. And if there is, to me, this is where human rights has a chance, because there is an internationally recognised system of human rights with courts and courts of justice and courts that I don't really know too much about, but all of which are there and can be an expression of that kind of local activity, and feed off it and promote it and lead it. I hope that's what happens, because if we're going to depend on all those guys who were at Copenhagen, we're all going to end up the creek without a paddle.
But is there a way of, if you like, challenging the failure of the rich countries to do things about climate change, to reach an agreement, that can be challenged perhaps through the courts or perhaps some other way, using human rights as a way of doing it, to challenge them to actually pull their finger out and do something? Come on.
Well, I think the channel the rich countries will have to use in terms of development cooperation and adaptation funding, development assistance, is going to have to enter into a stronger accountability framework. Absolutely, you know, and that's the big push next week in New York, and that will be the push over the years ahead. One of the reasons Copenhagen collapsed, one of the many reasons, was because the developing countries, the countries suffering most, simply didn't believe the promises in relation to adaptation funding that they were being sold. They didn't accept it, because they've been sold this story so often. I mean, in the Rome summit after the food crisis, there was promises in relation to funding which never came, and the number of people suffering from malnutrition and hunger rocketed. And they could see the same thing coming after Copenhagen, and it was one of the reasons they pulled the plug. And unless that funding commitment is framed in human rights and locked into an accountability system, you know, the governments in the South won't believe that the debate is rooted in human rights. I also think, if I might, that another crucial issue here is freedom of expression, assembly, right to information of people who want to protest and want to be part of it. If the talks and the processes are rooted in human rights, people should be allowed to be involved. And from what we saw in Copenhagen, where organisations and individuals who were there weren't even allowed access to the centre, right through to what we saw in Peru, when indigenous peoples tried to demonstrate and were killed. You know, across the globe we're seeing expression, assembly and beliefs being oppressed, and basic traditional civil and political rights being undermined in the context of people trying to stand up against climate change. And unless states recognise that and engage with that and include people, you know, we haven't a hope of convincing people that this is a process that's rooted in human rights.
Gentleman at the front here.
I just want to pick up on the idea of you talking about developed countries being held accountable and so forth. And it's a kind of question for all the panel, but perhaps particularly for journalists and Lawrence. And I wonder, do we need to do more to actually implicate ordinary people in the infringement of human rights, in the sense of consumers, in the sense of just ordinary people? We're talking about holding governments accountable, but we're not really talking about taking any other form of responsibility. You know, the discussion's very much being dominated by a government level thing, whereas, you know, every time you drive your car, effectively you're contributing to climate change. Do we need to do more to kind of hold ordinary people accountable and make those connections, so perhaps they then pressure the governments to actually, you know, act on change?
Hold on, someone's for you.
Well, I mean, I think journalists could try and do two things anyway, as much as we can. One is that I think in the last year or two, the whole debate about climate change has lost focus, and it's moved from looking at what's happening in wherever it is happening to a pointless, fruitless chewing the fat about whether the science is right, which has diverted a massive amount of print and a massive amount of, well, less TV actually, but still a significant amount. And I think we should be arguing like hell that's a fatuous debate, and that actually what we should be doing is much, much more of going to places like Chad or wherever wherever the trends are sharpest. And secondly, I think we should be. I think you're right. I mean, I think we should, in parallel with the series that we did, we also filmed with a family who lived in the West Country, who were doing all sorts of things like, you know, installing solar panels, and we actually had a day down there where we asked people to sign up to, which was actually wasn't our idea. It was the idea of a local school. And they asked people to sign up to a pledge that of 5 things, like they'd turn their thermostat down by 1 degree and things like that. That was seen in my place in ITV as the weakest part of the story, because it was all kind of you know, motherhood and apple pie and things like that. But actually, that's really, really important, because I think it engages our viewers or our readers, and also in a way tries to connect them with the people who are at the sharp end. If we can do that, then I think that gives power to the kind of local action that can be taken, that provides a platform or perhaps could propel the international talks further forward, or provide a platform for legal action on human rights.
Can I perhaps try and turn it upside down briefly to you, Come? I mean, you talked about Fortress Europe. Is there a way of using might sound slightly odd, but a way of using the reality of future population movement as a result of climate change, climate refugees, which is prompting a fortress Europe mentality, perhaps, to persuade the sort of people you're talking about who need to be held accountable that actually if you were to do something about climate change, then you won't have to deal with the human rights refugee issue, and maybe try and persuade people that the driver for them to take action at home, as Lawrence was describing, whatever, on climate change, might be a better way of dealing with the perceived threat of huge populations coming in and moving and threatening your borders.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose two wrongs don't make a right, and
well,
you know, I'm not sure that that's that I'd go down that road, or that you have to deal with these very complex issues head on, directly, you know, and I think you have to engage with the issue of, for example, conflict that's driven by desertification or migration, like we see in Darfur, directly as an issue, and deal with the push factors as well as dealing with the pull factors. But I think on the communications front, like the media are doing a fantastic job on raising awareness and understanding of climate change. Undoubtedly, I mean, it's been fantastic. But the problem is, there's no bad guys. I mean, the corporations are presenting themselves as the crystal clean, you know, silver bullets that are going to solve the problem of climate change through technology. And, you know, Shell and other companies like them are presenting themselves as the perfect solution. You've got the NGOs, obviously, you know, presenting themselves with the perfect solutions. You've got states and governments presenting themselves as the perfect solution. So when you get to somewhere like Copenhagen, you know, there's this singular discussion. Everyone's agreed climate change is bad. We're all here together, companies, states and NGOs, we're all going to solve it together. And in the middle of that, the media is searching for, you know, the spark that's going to bring the story to life. Where's the controversy in it? And that's the challenge. And then so when you get something like the conflict around the science, the media are naturally going to be drawn to that because it's the only way they can bring the story to life. And I think the challenge to all of us really is to rock the boat and to find it. Well, there are villains there. We know they're there. They're all over the place, and we've got to help the journalists and the communications profession to try and get to that you know, tension in the story and be able to really bring it to life. And if we don't do that and find the villains and the perpetrators and expose them and talk about them in an open way, the thing is going to stumble along, and you know, we're going to kind of mush our way into ad hoc solutions rather than really dealing with it.
You wanted to say something there. Well, yes.
Well, I'm not happy about the use of the term climate change. I mean, I like the term fine, but I think it's being used too broadly. There's sort of long-term climate change that has caused certain effects, and what man is doing now, the development, is causing further climate change. So climate change is both a long-term cause and you're using it casually as a short-term result. So looking at Lawrence's two clips, I wonder whether the first one on the Tibetan border, I mean, that was one that didn't have any perpetrators. There's desertification as a result of long-term factors, whereas the second one was deforestation, which is development. So I wanted to ask if any of you are following the litigation around the tar sands in Alberta, which I just heard about recently, because I think that will be a significant, whichever way that goes. And of course there was the Vedanta decision in India. So in a way, all of this should be under the trade talks, not Copenhagen. But the trade talks have been going nowhere, of course. Do you sort of have any comment on
Christoph?
that? I think there's a really good website, Climate Law, that regular updates readers on the different litigations and legal cases related to climate change. And yes, I have been following some of them. I'm not really familiar with the one, and it's Canada, isn't it? And, but what I've noticed, for instance, is that in all these cases, human rights are rarely an issue. And when the communities in Nigeria, for instance, challenge the gas flaring, then climate change and human rights come up side by side, and I think indigenous people have raised it in connection with the extension of Heathrow and other projects, but these are really exceptions. Usually it's not used, and I think that's partially because we have these conventions, but they don't really they don't have the teeth they need to have, and that for a farmer in Peru it's still impossible to take the government of the US to court because the legal remedies are sealed off at the national level. So and I think that's maybe something to think about, whether we need new procedural means. At the same time, I've just read that I think there is something like 50,000 cases pending before the European Court of Human Rights. And that's one of the strongest human rights conventions in the world. So the law might not have all the answers, unfortunately. There was a second part to your question, but sorry, I think I've forgotten that.
That's fine. I mean, to the degree the question was addressed at you, Lawrence, does it go back to your point about the fact that climate change is not the single cause of things, but it's one of a number of factors, and we're talking about a wider developmental.
Yeah, well, I mean, you talked about tar sands. I did a report in Canadian tar sands 2 years ago, and what there and in other places. One of the interesting things is people talk about rights. There, people talked about their right to fish. They believe that some of the chemicals used in the extraction process were affecting the fish. And that they weren't catching the same. They believed that fish had tumours. They have photographs and actual fish with bumps on the side. I don't know whether there were tumours or not, but that's what they believed. And then they get quite vehement about, we have a right to be able to fish here. But they wouldn't see that as a right, even in Canada, which is a reasonably litigious place, that they could take to court. And I think that's the problem with a lot of indigenous people. They don't believe they've got rights, which is why I'm really interested in your empowerment stuff, because they don't know how to do it. They don't know any lawyers, they don't know who to advise them, they don't know. I mean, Canada they do, that's a different thing, but lots of places I've been, people got no experience of ever having done that kind of thing, and they don't know what to do. Whether it would actually provide them with a relief, I don't know, because as you say, a lot of these things are at a national level, and it is really difficult to provide villains, which is not only a journalistic plus if you've got a villain, but also legally you know who the hell you're going to sue. I mean, one of the reasons we went to Mato Grosso is because the governor is the biggest soya farmer, and we doorstepped him, and he sent his security guards out and arrested, well, didn't arrest us, but they took us into a room and checked all our papers and things like that, so it looked good on telly anyway. But finding villains, I think you're right, Colin, it's really, really important, and there are villains there. Trying to empower people so that they believe that they can do something about it. That I think is either by through legal means, if that's available to them, or by some kind of more direct action. Lots of people I've met almost, you know, almost resigned to things happening. Those Indians were, I mean, one of the reasons I enjoyed being there was because they had loads of balls. They really wanted to get up there and hit someone. You know?
I mean, in terms of what LEAD does and that empowerment that Lawrence has just referred to, do the people that you're dealing with see it as, or do you even within LEAD see it as empowering them to deal with the effects of climate change, or is it a much broader spectrum where you go from sort of development at one end to climate change at the other, and somewhere in the middle there's this need across the whole spectrum for empowerment to give people the tools they need?
I think there's many points to be made there, and I think as we've seen, litigation has numerous limitations when it comes to climate change. It's very hard to pinpoint at someone and say you're responsible for this flood in Malawi. Who's responsible for the flood in Malawi? Partly climate change, partly developed countries, partly everybody, partly nobody, partly maybe something else. So it's actually very hard to take it to court and to relate it directly to climate change. Second thing is, as you said, connecting people to court is a much more complicated issue than it might seem at the beginning. We're talking about people who first have never been to court, Second, don't even know where the court is in the country. Thirdly, might not have the time when they're struggling every day to get their food, to afford a 2 years court case, transport, cost, lawyers, all that type of thing. So I don't think this litigation focus might be the most relevant for people on the ground in developing countries, and that is why we are not focusing on it, partly. Also because we are taking it not as a human rights NGO, but as an environment and development NGO. So we're not focusing on the kind of confrontation, pinpointing or people who are responsible, holding accountable. We're very much looking at this kind of empowerment, tackling discrimination in terms of getting rid of them and actually helping people to adapt. I think the other point is that legal approach should not be the only one. And we're talking about human rights, but it's much broader. And of course, as you were saying, you can look at human rights, but there's many other issues within climate change adaptation and climate change.
Something else from the audience, yes. Lady at the front here. We'll take a couple, actually, and then the lady in green at the back.
Yes, thanks. In your presentation in the beginning, you were mentioning the legal norms of accountability and participatory rights, and that made me think of a question my brother asked me the other day, which was, is there a way to sue corporations who are deliberately spreading misinformation about climate change? And my answer after about 1 second of analysis was probably not, because we vehemently protect free speech. But I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on what the international norms for participation are, so that rather than try to attack corporations who are spreading misinformation, we empower the people from the bottom up whose voices aren't being heard around the negotiation table, etc.
Have that in a moment. And let's just hear from the 3 rows back.
I work for a development organisation that also campaigns on climate justice, and we work a lot on climate finance. And what we've been hearing a lot about is how human rights law can be applied to states and also individuals. And from where we're coming from, the baddies, if you like, are often multilateral institutions, for example, the World Bank and the IMF. And I'm wondering whether it's true that in that case, human rights doesn't really come into play, because what we're seeing is the World Bank being used as a climate finance hub, and the UK government is giving 90% of its climate finance to the World Bank rather than the UN Adaptation Fund, which is very worrying given that the World Bank is a key lender or key investor in coal-fired power stations, and also we're doing some research at the moment into looking at the kind of conditions that the World Bank is putting onto these loans and also grants that they're giving to developing countries for adaptation. And I'm just wondering whether there's something that can be done about the World Bank.
So could you yeah, all right. But could you somehow attach, if the World Bank is going to be the villain that we all want, can we attach to the World Bank and the way it lends and the way it uses that money, which is being seen as the way to get the transfer across and be able to deal with this, to put human rights conditions on that money? Is that perhaps the way forward?
Well, I think bringing the two questions together, I mean, the World Bank fits within the multilateral system and the accountability mechanisms of the UN, and a key issue here is right to information. There's a duty on states and the multilateral system to disseminate information about its activities. Freedom of information is a right, and it's crucial and fundamental to participation and inclusion. And one of the key issues in relation to the World Bank and its policies and its programs is access to information for the communities that are impacted on by the activities of the World Bank. So this is coming, this issue of participation is crucial here, and it links the two questions. We have to ensure that programs that the bank is funding are discussed with and known about by the communities that are going to be involved. They have to have the information, and they have to be involved in the decision making. And as it's set up at the moment, that's not happening. I mean, states, for example, have an obligation to develop national adaptation plans, and they're supposed to develop those plans in consultation with communities. those consultation mechanisms are either non-existent or they're cursory. And you find huge communities that are completely blocked out from those consultations on the plans, and in some cases the plans don't even exist, in a lot of cases. So the World Bank is able to go about its business in the absence of any kind of national framework where information is available to people, and so they're disempowered and they're not able to exercise their rights. So access to information and right to participation is crucial to this.
Christoph?
Yeah, the World Bank has a set of so-called social safeguard policies in place that potentially grant fairly far-reaching rights to communities and individuals that are affected by World Bank financed projects. And one of their policies is on specifically on the rights of indigenous groups. And there's also an independent complaints mechanism that these groups could use. So I think, if you have a particular case, I'd be happy to look at this. And I think there might be ways and means to help the people you're working with. How effective these policies are is, I think, open to debate.
And who enforces those policies?
Well, but there's an independent inspection panel that issues recommendations to the World Bank, and in many cases the World Bank has taken up these recommendations and done something with them, and a couple of them projects, for instance, have been shelved because of the existing mechanism. But it's by far not strong enough, of course, in order to cover all cases. And
another question, so lady at the front here.
This is a question for Lawrence, mainly. So you were talking about how, as journalists, we should be going more into developing countries and speaking about stories from the ground. I'm just wondering, with correspondence being cut back from newspapers and indeed news desks being shrunk at the rate they are, how is this journalism going to be funded, in your opinion? And Julian as well.
Oh, I wish I could answer that question. Don't we?
Yeah, I wish we could. Yeah, we could do with the money. Yeah.
Well, if there's anyone out there who's got some money to spare,
we'll have a whip round afterwards.
We can have a beer afterwards and talk about it. You're right. One of the reasons I think the debate has, or coverage, I think, has declined in the last couple of years is because so have journalistic resources. I doubt very much whether we do that series that we did then 4 years ago. I don't think we'd do it now. It was very expensive. It was the most expensive single thing ITV News spent money on that year, and I don't think we'd do it again. We did lives from impossible places, like glaciers in Greenland and on the Rio Blanco in Rio Negro, sorry, in Brazil. I just don't think we'd spend the money on that anymore. I don't think anyone would. And that is a huge problem, and I wish I knew the answer. Blogging, I think, helps. I think the kind of using new technologies helps, but I don't think it solves the problem, because that's one way of getting to know what's happening in those places. I don't think it's necessarily the most forceful way. When I did a quick Google search yesterday on the tribe in Mato Grosso, and there's only been one piece that Google came up with in the last 4 years, other than stuff on websites from developmental organisations and charities. There was one piece in the Sunday Times about 2 years ago. These guys are, one, they're very picturesque. You can go and film them. They'll play their flutes for you. They have lots of good journalistic things going for you, and they're taking direct action. But you're right. Try and sell that story to a foreign desk now, I think, would be really tough. And I just wish I knew how we could sell it.
Well, the foreign desks have done, I think, what ours have done, which at Channel 4 News, which is to acknowledge the fact that the money is tight, and it is very, very tight. We've had huge cutbacks at Channel 4 over the last year or so with the contraction of advertising budget. Channel 4 has lost something of the order of 15 to 20% of its income. We all across the board, whether it be drama, documentaries, or whatever within Channel 4, we had to lose 10% from our budgets. We lost staff, we lost programmes, we lost More 4 News, we lost the Channel 4 News at noon. So that's really hit our budgets very hard. And I think the decision that was taken by our foreign desk and our editors, and I suspect it's probably the same with Lawrence over at ITV News, it's probably less so with the BBC because they're awash with cash, but is that you harbour your resources and you do it in one big hit. So you do like Lawrence did, and you do spend a lot of money in one big hit on that subject and that issue, and then you just don't do it again for quite a long time. We did a lot at Channel 4 News in Brazil, much smaller scale than the ITV production, ahead of Copenhagen. Went out there, series of films, presented the programme live for most of a week from Brazil ahead of Copenhagen, because a decision was taken that this would be, if you like, our hit at this subject. But I suspect I probably won't go to Cancun for Channel 4 News, because it'll be seen as a procedural meeting that's on the way towards, and nothing of any real substance or concrete will come out of it. And you can as easily cover it from agencies in London. So, if you like, the compromise solution is the big hit, and then you forget about it. Another question from the audience, perhaps. Yes, there.
Part question, part comment, but I think comment to start. I wouldn't lose faith, I really wouldn't, because I think the amazing ability to be resilient and to think of creative solutions is manifest in this room tonight. So I think the possibility of engaging people in new and creative and interesting ways, where we turn up the volume on the voice that isn't yet audible and give the microphone over to the people who are taking direct action, talking in their own language, in their own terms, and engage with a process with them in partnership that comes back to that point about participation and partnership, is possibly the way that complex ways of handling this will also find complex and interesting and interactive solutions. And the question was just going to be linked to that, so I'm not sure why it's humming. And the question linked to that was going to be about disaggregating, so unpicking rather than clumping together. That at the moment we're talking about human rights in one little corner and land rights in another and indigenous people's rights in another. And I wonder if that's the key rather than trying to link it all together. It might be controversial, but it doesn't necessarily all fit together in easy and neat ways. And is there a way to talk in a nuanced, sophisticated, complex way about these issues so that you hone right in to the solution that's required in each instance, rather than trying to have overarching, thematic, one-size-fits-all solutions where the one-size-fits-all type people or companies are going to advertise in a way that marginalises others. You know, is the key actually taking it all apart and dealing with dog whistle, single issues in an effective, rational way?
Con.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you actually get right down to the specific cases, that's exactly what happens. I mean, the two campaigns that were mentioned earlier on, just examples, the Lubicon Cree in Alberta, a campaign that Amnesty is involved in, you know, where it's, you know, the litigation on right to health, and, you know, because people's health is being impacted negatively arising from the activities of the oil companies, opens up a strategy where, using the right to health, we can talk about the bigger issues. And by the way, the Lubicon Cree is an interesting example because it points out to the fact that this isn't just about the developing world. This isn't just about poor countries. In some of the richest countries in the world, communities are experiencing environmental degradation, human rights abuses linked to climate change, and I just mentioned that. But the other one on the Orissa case, the Vedanta case, the Dundrea Khan, who won a fantastic victory last week or the week before. Again, it was going into very specific issues around, you know, tribal homelands, the right to tribal homelands, the right to land, right to food. By getting into very specific issues, we were able to win a much bigger case. But I think when it goes from the specific to the abstract, we really are obliged to talk about this in a more integrated way, I think.
If I may
Yeah.
jump in as well, I think the danger is if you don't have a broad kind of philosophy framework, you encounter cases where people focus on property rights, for example, and actually use human rights to go against climate change adaptation mitigation programs. So I think it's not that straightforward, as I said, and you need this kind of broad framework just to put kind of guidelines on how you're going to use human rights with climate change.
Okay, we're nearly out of time. Can I just put one question to each of you on the panel before we finish? And to kind of go back to the heart of what we're talking about tonight. Does, and it partly addresses the issue of what we do here at Frontline Club in relation to journalism as well, does framing the climate change issue as a human rights issue, does that change the way we can present climate change and perhaps get it across more easily to people and our audiences as journalists that we can't when we talk about things that are perhaps too remote, like sea level rise and so on? Christoph, you should start.
It's difficult for me to say, I'm not a journalist, but the problem that we as lawyers usually have is that we work in a very abstract environment, and we do not produce the human stories that the media need and that funders need to find a justification for what we do. So I think, to me, it seems like it might be a good vehicle. I would maybe warn you to use only human rights. As I said before, I think this notion of justice is an important one as well, because you know, you can protect somebody's human rights in one setup, and then by, for instance, fundamentally changing the way we consume, live and work, and then on the sidelines potentially violating human rights of marginalized people in this country. So I think you need to look at the broader picture, and you need to find equitable and fair solution in different societies as well.
Tom, does human rights offer?
Well, I suppose one useful thing that the human rights framework offers in terms of communications and the media is, well, it's a framework that people know. It's something that people are increasingly understand and embrace, and they get it. And talking about the right to a healthy environment, talking about the right to health, the right to housing, and you know, these environmental issues in a rights context is buying into a kind of a communications message that people understand, and they can kind of switch on and go, yeah, I understand that, and it makes it easy to communicate the story.
Marina.
I think using the human rights discourse should be a way to actually look into discriminations, an issue of empowerment. So more than the human rights discourses might be about the kind of on-the-ground problem that are happening due to climate change, and that we need to focus on in this issue.
Finally, Lawrence.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said before from the floor and what Colin said, that human rights are about humans. Human stories are the things that appeal to our viewers. That's why in that series, we did 2 pieces from each location, and one of those was almost entirely about people. You know, the longest running legal sort of sciencey story I know, it's not an environment story, is thalidomide. And I did a report 2 years ago on people still battling away to try and get compensation out of the German government. That was, what, 30 years after the Sunday Times? Legal action gels all the issues. From a journalist point of view, I love it when someone says to me, these people have polluted my farm, they've ruined my crops, and I'm taking them to court. So, oh, great, because if you're taking them to court, I've got a focus, I've got a peg, and I can sell the story to my news desk. Otherwise, they might say, oh, well, he's just a farmer who's having a whinge, isn't he? The legal process justifies doing the story, and at the same time is very human, because there has to be a litigant, and so I think that's very powerful.
Well, look, it's been a fascinating evening. Thank you all very much indeed for coming this evening. My thanks to Lawrence McGinty, to Marine Destrey, I'll get it right, to Christoph Schwartz and Colma Connachain. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves, and we'll see you in the bar downstairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian.